She stepped off the stagecoach with fire in her hair, and within minutes, her entire future turned to ash. In a dusty town where superstition ran deeper than the mine shafts, Evelyn McAllister arrived with hope stitched into every seam of her dress. She'd crossed counties to marry a man she'd never met, believing his promise was her second chance. But when he saw her red hair, he rejected her on the spot in front of the whole town, laughed, called her cursed. Imagine standing alone on a dirt road, luggage at your feet, whispers all around, and no one coming to help. Would you run, hide, or would you stay? This is the true story of a woman who stayed, who faced a town's silence, a stranger's quiet kindness, and her own buried grief, and somehow turned it all into a love that burned steady for a lifetime. If you've ever felt out of place, judged too soon, or told you were too much, this story will speak straight to your heart. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the day the flame first arrived in Redstone Ridge. The dust settled, and all they could see was a woman with fire on her head, and not one soul thought it meant hope. The stagecoach door creaked open with a long groan, its hinges protesting the dry mountain wind that swept down from the ridges like whispers of old grief. Evelyn McAllister stepped down with care, her gloved hand lingering on the weathered frame a second longer than necessary. Her boots met the packed earth of Redstone Ridge, Colorado, 1881 for the first time. The air was thinner here, sharper. She drew it into her chest and held it there, bracing against more than just altitude. Her journey had taken 12 days, 3 stage lines, and all but 40 cents of her savings. Every bump in the road had loosened something, fear, perhaps, or memory. What remained was folded tightly inside her a name, a promise, and a letter signed in careful ink by Sterling Kane, the man who would become her husband. Or so she believed. She adjusted her skirt with a practiced grace, though the fabric bore the wrinkles of travel and a few smudges of trail dust. Her bonnet, which had once been ivory, tilted back just enough to reveal what no amount of careful stitching could hide her hair. A cascade of vibrant red. It glinted like copper under the midday sun, unruly curls slipping free from pins and framing her pale face. Evelyn had tried, more times than she cared to count, to tame it, to dull its brightness. But out here, with no mirror and no time, it shone like a signal flare, and people noticed. They always did. The main street was lined with uneven wooden walkways and buildings that seemed held together more by grit than Nails Mercantile, saloon, livery, post, and a modest hotel with peeling paint. Life bustled in the quiet way of frontier towns, measured, wary, and ever watchful. Every head turned toward her. Men in suspenders and dust-covered hats paused mid-conversation. A woman with 2 children tightened her grip on their small hands. An old man on a bench leaned forward, squinting. Evelyn felt their stares as if they were weight, not welcome, not curiosity, just judgment, sharp and familiar. She stood straighter. Sterling Kane emerged from the door of the Mercantile with the confident stride of a man used to being in charge. His mustache was neatly trimmed, boots polished, and vest buttoned tight against his growing middle. His eyes found her immediately. She offered a tentative smile and stepped toward him. "Mr. Kane," she asked gently. He halted. His expression shifted in 3 beats: recognition, surprise, and then something colder. His gaze dropped to her hair, narrowed like he'd spotted something unclean. "You didn't mention that," he said, voice flat. Evelyn blinked. I didn't think it relevant," she replied, her voice steady, though her fingers clutched her satchel a little tighter. "We wrote of values, of upbringing. I sent my photograph." Kane scoffed. "Yes, black and white. Not enough to see what God painted in warning." The words struck like winter wind, unexpected, but bone deep. He looked around quickly, as though hoping no one had seen him speak to her. "This won't do," he muttered. "You don't understand the kind of trouble redheads bring. Out here, people are superstitious. You'll ruin my business before you even unpack." "Mr. Kane," she began, heat rising in her chest, not from shame but disbelief. "I rescind the agreement," he interrupted. "You'll find return coaches at the depot. I suggest you catch the next eastbound one." Then, with barely a nod, he turned and walked away. Just like that, the town didn't blink. It just kept watching. Evelyn stood still, the sound of her heartbeat louder than any hoofbeat on the road. Her trunk had been placed beside her, a travel-worn thing holding the last pieces of a life no longer hers. The silence stretched. A dog barked in the distance. Someone coughed, but no one spoke to her. No one moved. She could have folded in that moment. Many might have. But something about the way her father once taught her to ride came back then sit tall, even when the horse bucks. So she did. She inhaled once, the breath shaking its way down, and turned her eyes forward, and that's when she saw him, not approaching, not offering help, just watching. A tall figure leaned against the hitching post in front of the saloon, his hat casting a shadow across his face. Boots scuffed, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands calm at his sides. He didn't stare the way others had. He didn't seem surprised. He simply looked at her with a kind of quiet knowing, not at her hair, not at her shame, at her resolve. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and Evelyn, bruised, humiliated, standing alone in a strange town with only her name and her stubbornness, felt something flicker. Not rescue, recognition. The stranger tipped his hat, just slightly, as if to say, "I see you." And for the first time since the stagecoach doors closed behind her in Georgia, Evelyn McAllister did not feel entirely alone. Sometimes the kindest hearts wear dust and silence instead of uniforms and medals. The man didn't move for a long while. He simply watched, arms crossed, one boot hooked lazily around the hitching post. There was no urgency in him, but no indifference either. The kind of stillness he carried wasn't born from apathy. It was the kind that came from learning to wait for things worth waiting for. Evelyn bent to adjust the strap of her trunk, pretending she didn't notice. She could still feel the stares behind her, though most folks had gone back to whatever they were doing before her arrival. Or perhaps they were pretending to, same as she. The moment she touched the worn leather handle, he stepped forward. "Heavy?" he asked, voice like gravel softened by time. She straightened, startled more by how gently the words were delivered than by the question itself. His face came into clearer view now, early 30s, perhaps. Tanned skin from the sun, a clean line of jaw half hidden by a few days' stubble, and eyes that looked like storm clouds settling on the horizon. Not threatening, just deep and unreadable. "I can manage," she said, not unkindly. "I didn't ask that," he replied. "I asked if it was heavy." There was no smile in his voice, but there was no edge either. Just steadiness. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it is." He reached down without another word, lifting the trunk with an ease that made her blink. "Where to?" he asked. That stopped her, because she didn't know. The only arrangement she had was with Sterling Kane, who had just walked off as if she were a misplaced package. She had no family, no letters of introduction, no inn reservation, just the name of a town and the hope it might hold a second chance. She began, flustered. "I don't have anywhere just yet." The man didn't look surprised. He shifted the trunk to his other hand and nodded down the road. "Come on, Clara Whitcomb runs a boarding room behind her dress shop. She's fair, keeps fresh linens, and she's not the superstitious kind." Evelyn blinked at him. "Why are you helping me?" He glanced at her, expression unreadable, because no one else did. They walked in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't press. She noticed he kept a respectful pace, adjusted his stride so she wouldn't have to hurry in her travel-worn boots. That small consideration stirred something in her, like warm broth after a cold day. The shop appeared after 2 blocks, a simple wooden building with blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. A sign above the door read, "Clara's Stitch and Hem." The smell of lavender and starch drifted faintly from inside. The man set her trunk down gently, not dropping it like baggage, but placing it like something worth keeping safe. "She'll be in the back," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Tell her Wade sent you." "Wade," Evelyn repeated. He nodded once. "Wade Coulter." She offered a tentative smile. "Evelyn McAllister." Another nod, then he turned as if to leave. "Wait," she called after him. "Why me?" He paused, hand already on his hat brim, looked at her, really looked this time. His gaze didn't flinch. "Most folks here look at you and see trouble," he said evenly. "I saw a woman stand alone in the street, hold her chin up, and not break." Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, like someone had lit a match inside her, just enough to push back the cold. "I don't help people because I pity them," Wade added, voice low. "I help people who've already proven they don't need it, just deserve it anyway." Then he tipped his hat, and without another word, walked off down the road. His steps were slow but sure, kicking up little puffs of dust as he moved. Evelyn watched until he disappeared past the livery stable, and even then, she stood for a moment longer, staring at the space he left behind. Inside the shop, the faint sound of scissors and humming drifted through the door. The porch swing creaked again. She gathered her skirts and stepped forward, placing her hand on the doorknob. There was something unfamiliar in her chest. Not relief, not comfort, hope, thin, fragile, and uncertain, but alive. They gave her thread and fabric. She stitched her dignity back into place. Clara Whitcomb didn't ask many questions. She simply opened the door, took one look at Evelyn's tired eyes and wind-whipped dress, and stepped aside. Rooms upstairs, shared baths down the hall. Breakfast is at 7, supper at 6. There was no welcome, no judgment, just space. And for a woman like Evelyn, that was more than enough. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and starch. The bed was narrow, the quilt worn but clean. A single window faced east, and when the morning light crept in the next day, it fell across her pillow like a quiet blessing. She rose early, unsure of what she owed, and unwilling to be idle. Clara met her in the kitchen, offered coffee with a nod, then set her to work sorting thread spools by color. By the end of the week, Evelyn had sewn 2 hems, fitted a pair of sleeves, and learned how to refill the coal stove in the back room. Clara didn't praise, but she didn't correct much either. And that, Evelyn had learned, was its own kind of approval. The townsfolk, however, were slower to come around. At first, they kept their distance, women clutching their baskets tighter when she passed. Children stared with wide eyes at the flame-colored hair she no longer tried to hide. Evelyn bore it all with a grace that didn't always come easy. Some days it scraped at her like sand in a wound. Other days, it simply passed over her, like wind over wheat. She heard the whispers, Of course, Sterling Kane had not been subtle in his rejection. Word traveled fast in small towns, and even faster when scandal carried it. He'd told more than one customer that she was a bad omen in skirts, that her hair alone would bring drought or disease, that he had narrowly escaped something unnatural. Clara didn't entertain such talk in her shop. "You bring gossip, you take your business elsewhere," she said once, without raising her voice. And just like that, the murmurs stopped at least within those four walls, but Evelyn heard stories all the same. Over fabric bolts and dress forms, women spoke freely, as if she were invisible. She listened quietly about Kane's previous wife, who died mysteriously of nervous exhaustion, about how his last employee had left in tears, about how he refused to stock lavender soap because it invited sin. If Evelyn ever needed proof she'd escaped more than a bad match, this was it. She stitched quietly, each pull of the needle a meditation. There was comfort in the rhythm pin, fold, hem, tie. The fabric did not judge. The thread never asked what color her hair was. By the third week, her presence no longer caused heads to turn. And then, one Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. A woman entered the shop just as Evelyn was sweeping the front stoop. She was older, late 50s, perhaps with a stiff hat and a posture that had once known corsets. Her hands were wrinkled but strong. A girl of about 10 trailed behind her, clutching a bonnet and staring at the floor. Clara looked up from her ledger. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thorne?" "Mrs. Whitcomb," the woman replied, then glanced toward Evelyn. There was a pause, a long one. Evelyn held the broom a little tighter. She braced for the usual edge of caution, the awkward dismissal. Instead, Mrs. Thorne spoke clearly. "I hear you've taken on help." Clara nodded once. "I need a new Sunday dress for this one," she said, jerking her chin toward the girl. "Her ma passed last winter. She's growing fast. I have fabric at home, but no hand steady enough for darts. Can your girl here sew straight?" Evelyn's breath caught. Clara didn't even blink. "She can." Mrs. Thorne turned back to Evelyn. "I'll be by Monday with the cloth. I expect it ready in 2 weeks. Lilac ribbon at the collar." Then she left. The little girl lingered for a heartbeat, then looked up. "Your hair's pretty," she whispered, then followed her grandmother out the door. Evelyn stood frozen, not from shock, but something else, something warmer. "Don't let it go to your head," Clara muttered, handing her a needle and a grin that barely curved her lips. But Evelyn saw it. That night, she worked late, folding muslin and rethreading bobbins. The lantern light cast soft gold across her hands, and for the first time since arriving in Redstone Ridge, Evelyn didn't feel like an intruder in borrowed space. The shop was quiet when she finally stepped outside. The sky was turning from peach to indigo. She turned to lock the door and saw it. A small burlap sack hung neatly from the nail beside the entrance. Inside, 6 red apples gleamed in the fading light. No note, no tag, just the gift. Evelyn held the sack close for a long moment. Wade. She didn't need proof, didn't need a signature. There was a stillness to the gesture that matched the man, quiet, deliberate, honest. She placed 1 apple on the windowsill for morning, then climbed the stairs with the rest. Her steps were lighter than usual. Upstairs, in the quiet of her room, Evelyn McAllister curled beneath her quilt, the scent of apple skin and lavender soap rising with the night. And for the first time in weeks, she slept without dreams. Sometimes, love starts with silence. A chair pulled out, a door held open, a cup of warm milk. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about Wade Coulter. He didn't move in bold declarations or grand gestures. He moved like a river finding its way through stone, patient, steady, and without asking permission. It began with a coat. Late one morning, as Evelyn was pinning a hem in the front of the shop, the bell over the door gave its familiar chime. She looked up to see Wade standing in the doorway, rain from the early morning mist still dampening his hat brim. He held a coat in his hands. "Split a seam," he said, lifting the worn fabric. "Shoulder gave out when I hoisted a barrel." Evelyn took the coat carefully, fingers brushing the thick, sun-faded canvas. The tier was clean thread, worn thin, not clumsy. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. Her hands lingered on it longer than necessary. "I can have it by tomorrow," she said softly. "No rush," Wade replied. Then added, after a beat, "Take your time." He lingered longer than usual, eyes scanning the rows of fabric bolts, the half-finished dresses on mannequins. He looked like a man trying to find the right words and not sure he needed them. "You've made the place look different," he said. Evelyn tilted her head. "Different, lighter." He answered. She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she nodded. "Thank you." He nodded back and left. That evening, Evelyn stitched the coat with a focus she hadn't felt in days. Her hands moved with quiet reverence, not because it was a coat, but because it was his. She reinforced the seams, added a tiny line of embroidery on the inside lining. Nothing showy, just enough to know someone had cared. The next morning, when she handed it back to him, he didn't check the stitches, didn't ask about the cost. He simply looked at her and said, "It's warmer already," and left. The days that followed brought more of him. Not often, not predictably, but enough. Sometimes he'd drop off a spool of thread she hadn't asked for. Other times it was a loaf of bread wrapped in muslin or a spare horseshoe left by the porch just in case. He never stayed long, but he always looked at her as if her presence steadied something in him. And Evelyn began to see the pattern. She noticed how he tipped his hat to her and no one else, how he never turned away first when their eyes met, how his voice, low and even, softened when he said her name. One evening, as they stood together beside the shop's porch rail, she spoke of Georgia, of fire. It had taken her home in less than an hour, a dry spring, a kitchen flame, a gust of wind. Her parents had been inside, so had the family dog. All gone before she could scream for help. "I lost more than people," she said, not looking at him. "I lost the sound of my own laughter." For a long time, Wade didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. He reached over, slowly, and laid his hand on the porch rail beside hers, not touching, but near enough to feel. And in the space between silence and speech, Evelyn felt steadied. That night, as thunder rolled across the distant ridges, Evelyn stayed late to finish a bodice for Mrs. Thorne's granddaughter. Rain tapped at the windows, insistent and cold. The oil lamp flickered in protest, casting long shadows across the floor. She hadn't brought her shawl. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had turned mean. It wasn't far to the boarding room, just down the block, but the wind clawed through her dress like winter fingers. She barely made it 3 steps when she heard his voice. "Miss McAllister." She turned. Wade stood beneath the awning across the street, already soaked to the bone. He moved toward her without waiting, and in one motion pulled his own coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around hers. "You'll catch chill," he said simply. She looked up at him, hair damp, lashes heavy, breath-catching. "So will you." He gave a shrug that barely registered. "I've known worse." They walked in silence, his coat heavy on her shoulders, smelling again of wood smoke and earth. When they reached the door to Clara's, he didn't wait for thanks, just tipped his hat and turned back into the rain. Evelyn climbed the stairs with the coat still wrapped around her. She didn't take it off. Not right away. She hung it over the back of her chair, watching the drops fall and pool beneath it. Then she placed her palm against the sleeve just once and closed her eyes. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something steady, something warm. And it was starting to take root. When a wounded soul tells its story, and the other soul doesn't run away, that's how trust begins. Wade Coulter was not a man who offered pieces of himself easily. He spoke in half sentences and long silences, like someone who'd learned the cost of saying too much. Evelyn didn't mind. Her own wounds had taught her that healing sometimes came in stillness, not speech. But there are moments when silence becomes something else, an invitation. And one evening in late October, as the wind rustled dry leaves along the wooden sidewalks of Redstone Ridge, Wade opened the door a little wider. They sat on the back steps behind Clara's shop, sipping warm cider in chipped mugs. The sun had dipped low, casting long amber shadows across the fence posts and drying laundry lines. Evelyn had just finished recounting a small memory her father singing hymns off-key while fixing a broken fence. It made her laugh, soft and surprised. Wade watched her for a long moment before speaking. "My brother's name was Samuel," he said quietly. She stilled, not out of fear, but reverence. He was 2 years older. Wade continued, voice even, taller than me, smarter, too. Always knew the right thing to say. Mama called him her sunrise. Evelyn said nothing, just listened. We both signed up for the cavalry the same day. Wade went on. He didn't want to go, but I did. I thought it'd make men of us. Thought we'd come back proud, carrying medals. He paused, the cup in his hand growing still. We came back in 2 wagons, one empty, one not. The wind picked up slightly. Evelyn let it pass between them. I stopped talking for a long while after that. He said, didn't see much sense in words that couldn't bring him back. Evelyn reached over, not to comfort, not to fill the space, but to let him know she heard him. Her hand brushed lightly against his sleeve. "That's why you stay quiet," she whispered. He nodded once. "Not because I don't feel, just because some things don't fit in sentences." They sat there until the light faded completely. Later that week, as Sunday approached, Evelyn stood in front of her modest wardrobe, fingers hesitating over a navy blue dress. It was plain, but well fitted. The hem touched just above her ankle boots, and the collar bore a row of tiny white buttons she had sewn herself. It had been weeks since she'd set foot inside St. Andrew's Church. The last time was the day she arrived, when eyes followed her like shadows. But this Sunday, she wasn't walking in alone. She turned to Wade as they stood outside Clara's gate. "Would you?" "Walk with me," she asked, voice barely above the morning breeze. He nodded, no hesitation. They walked side by side down Main Street. The few townsfolk already milling about paused, glancing toward them, not as sharp as before, not unkind, curious, perhaps thoughtful. "Mrs. Thorne offered a polite nod as she passed. "Mr. Halpern from the general store tipped his hat. Sheriff Abrams muttered something about the weather. Evelyn felt the shift, not dramatic, not miraculous, but real. People didn't fear what Wade stood beside. The wooden steps of the church creaked beneath their feet as they climbed. The bell tolled above them, echoing across the ridges. Inside, the pews smelled of wax and cedar. Hymnals rested neatly in each row. Light filtered through narrow windows, catching flecks of dust that danced like quiet blessings in the air. They sat together in the third pew from the back. The sermon was simple, spoken in the measured drawl of Pastor Winslow, an aging man with kind eyes and a cough he never acknowledged. He spoke of forgiveness that day, not grand, thunderous forgiveness, but the kind that took root in small, steady choices. Evelyn's eyes burned, not with tears, but with memory. When the final hymn began, she didn't sing, but she stood, shoulders square, hands resting on the edge of the pew. And as the congregation bowed for the closing prayer, Evelyn let her hand slip sideways just enough to find Wade's. She didn't hold it, just touched, just enough. Wade didn't flinch. He didn't move away, but his fingers, calloused and warm, shifted ever so slightly, not to grab hers, but to anchor. The prayer ended. The people rose, and no one stared. Evelyn breathed in deeply, for the first time in that church, as though the walls no longer pressed down on her chest. Outside, the sunlight was soft, slanting through the trees in lazy beams. Wade offered to walk her back. She nodded, and they stepped off the porch, boots crunching over dry leaves. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That night, Evelyn wrote her mother's name in a small notebook she kept beside her bed. Just her name, in neat cursive, the first time she'd written it since the fire. And beneath it, one more word beginning. He ran into the mine when everyone else ran out. Because some lives matter more than one's own. It began with a sound, low and distant, like thunder rolling deep beneath the ground, just enough to rattle the oil lamps in Clara's shop, to make the sewing needles pause mid-air, to hush even the busiest chatter on Main Street. Then came the second sound, sharper, louder, like a groan from the belly of the earth itself. Evelyn looked up from the sewing table, the hairs on her neck rising. Clara's eyes met hers, already wide with knowing. And then came the bell sharp, urgent. 3 long clangs from the tower above the sheriff's office. Thornhill shaft. Clara whispered, "Something's gone wrong." They both moved at once. By the time Evelyn reached the mine, a crowd had gathered. The mouth of the shaft gaped like a wounded animal, spewing smoke and dust. Men were shouting orders, names, prayers. Horses pawed the ground nervously. Women huddled together near the fence line, clutching children, handkerchiefs, rosaries. "Who's in there?" Evelyn asked, breathless, grabbing the arm of the nearest worker. He turned, face blackened with soot, eyes frantic. "Partial collapse on the north tunnel," he said. "They're trying to count heads. Some made it out. Others." "Wade Coulter," she interrupted. The man froze, then nodded slowly. He went back in. Evelyn's chest tightened. He saw a kid get separated, went after him, just picked up a lantern and ran in like the damn floor wasn't shaking. Which kid? Eli Thorne, Daniel's grandson. She knew the name, of course she did. Eli was the quiet one, always watching the world from behind wide, curious eyes. He'd once given her a feather wrapped in twine as a thank you for a story she'd told in school. Now he was somewhere beneath the earth. And so was Wade. Panic rose like bile in Evelyn's throat. She pushed forward, past the gathered crowd, until she reached the edge of the caution line. Her boots sank into the wet ground. The sky, once clear, had turned gray, heavy with rain. She stood motionless, staring at the collapsed entrance, willing it to open. Time slowed. Minutes stretched. Rain began to fall in earnest, thin at first, then relentless. Still, she didn't move. "You should go inside," someone muttered behind her. "You'll catch your death." She ignored them. The miners tried to dig, a frantic, messy effort with picks and shovels, bare hands, anything they could find. Buckets moved from man to man. Lanterns flickered. Rocks crumbled. But the shaft continued to groan warnings in the deep. The foreman shook his head. "No good. It's too unstable. Any more weight, and we'll lose the support beams." "So we leave them," Evelyn said, voice sharp despite the cold. We walk away. He looked at her, tired and torn. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. But sometimes the only thing you can do is wait. Wait." She hated that word. She had waited once for letters that never came, for a door that never opened after the fire, for someone to tell her it wasn't her fault. Waiting had always meant loss, but now she had no choice. She stood there for hours. Rain soaked through her shawl, her dress, her boots. It matted her red hair to her face, slid down her spine like ice. Clara arrived with a coat. Evelyn refused it. Maggie Thorne arrived with blankets. Evelyn passed them to an older woman, then stepped closer to the fence line, closer to where he might still be breathing. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. The miners, one by one, stopped digging. Evelyn didn't, not with her hands, but with her presence. She stayed rooted to the spot, as if her stillness alone might hold the earth together. She thought of his hands steady on a coffee mug, on a saddle strap, brushing hers in a church pew. She thought of his coat, warm across her shoulders in the rain. Of the apples left on the porch without a note. Of how he never tried to fix her, just saw her. A loud crack split the air. A section of timber gave way near the mine mouth, collapsing into a pile of stone and broken hope. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Nothing we can do tonight," someone muttered. "Wait for morning." "No," Evelyn said softly, almost to herself. She turned and walked straight to the church. The door creaked open under her hand. The space was dark, empty, quiet. She hadn't been inside since that Sunday when her hand brushed Wade's. She hadn't come to pray in earnest since before the fire took everything. But now she dropped to her knees. The wood floor was cold, damp from her soaked skirts. She knelt anyway, folded her hands, closed her eyes. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," she whispered, "but I'm here." She let the silence answer. "Please," she said, "don't take him. Not him. He's—" She broke there. Couldn't finish. "He's the first thing that's felt real in years." Her shoulders shook, not with sobs, but with the effort to hold them back. She pressed her forehead to the pew and stayed there. For minutes, maybe hours. The storm outside rolled on. But inside the church, Evelyn stayed in that silence, not for forgiveness, not for answers, just for Wade, just for hope. What breaks open a mine might also break open a lie. The sun rose late the next morning, thick clouds still veiling the sky as if the heavens hadn't quite recovered from the storm. But with the first light came a sound, sharp, urgent, full of life, a voice echoing down Main Street. "They found 'em. They're alive." Evelyn was still on her knees in the chapel when Clara burst through the doors, breathless, soaked to the elbows in mud. "They pulled Wade out," she said, "and the boy too. They're hurt, but they're breathing." Evelyn didn't speak. She only rose legs unsteady, heart thudding, and ran. By the time she reached the makeshift medical tent pitched near the depot, Wade was already lying on a cot, pale, his left shoulder wrapped tight with blood-stained bandages. His shirt had been cut away. Dirt clung to his hairline, and his hands, those steady hands, were scratched raw. But his chest moved. In, out, slow, steady. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The doctor glanced up and gave a curt nod. Fractured ribs, dislocated shoulder, lost some blood. He'll live. She wanted to fall to her knees again, but not in prayer this time. In thanks. Wade stirred just once, eyes fluttering open for a brief second, and when they did, they found hers. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Evelyn reached out, brushing a damp curl from his brow, and whispered, "Rest now." She stayed by his side, and while the town buzzed with news of survival, another truth was clawing its way to the surface, one more dangerous than rock and rubble. Sterling Kane had been pacing the outer edge of the crowd all morning, a show of concern plastered across his face. But whispers spread faster than flames in a dry barn. By noon, the whispers turned to shouts. The foreman, eyes rimmed red with fury, approached Sheriff Abrams with a torn ledger in hand. Kane cut the safety budget, he said, slamming the ledger down. Took the coin meant for shoring up the lower shafts, pocketed it, signed his own name to the vouchers. The sheriff's brow darkened. "You sure had a carpenter ready to lay new beams last week?" Kane told him the money'd been reallocated, said the mine was stable. It wasn't just an oversight, it was negligence. And it nearly killed a child and a man the town had begun to trust more than their own mayor. By sundown, Kane's store was shuttered. He'd vanished, bags packed, headed east on the freight train. No one stopped him, not this time. But the town hadn't heard the last of him. 2 days later, word arrived from a nurse in Kansas City. She had worked years ago at a small sanitarium, knew Kane's name, knew his wife. His first wife didn't die of fever. She wrote in a letter to Sheriff Abrams. She ran, bruised ribs, broken wrist. She faked illness to get sent here, then fled with the help of a friend. The final line stung. She was trying to survive him. Evelyn read the letter in silence. For years, Sterling Kane had painted himself as a pious man, a victim of bad luck and cursed women. But like the mine, what lay beneath the surface had finally collapsed, and this time, it wasn't rocks that buried him. It was truth. That evening, Evelyn returned to the boarding house with a pot of broth, a jar of lavender salve, and a book of poems. Wade was still in bed, propped up now, color slowly returning to his cheeks. He opened his eyes when she entered. "I told you I'd be fine," he rasped. "You said no such thing," she replied gently, setting the tray down. "You just went running into a mine like a man who thought himself made of stone." His lips curved just slightly, felt more like clay after the third beam fell. She laughed a soft, choked sound, half joy, half sorrow. She pulled the chair closer and sat beside him, pouring water with careful hands. "Eli's safe," she whispered. Wade nodded once. "Good boy." There was a long pause. No need for explanations, no need for big declarations, just presence. She reached for his hand, not lightly this time, not in passing, but fully, fingers intertwining, firm and deliberate. "You scared me," she said. "I scared myself," he murmured. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was full of all the words they didn't need to speak, of everything that had grown between them, slow and quiet and real. As Wade drifted to sleep again, Evelyn stayed. She watched his chest rise and fall, watched the crease in his brow soften, watched the man who had once stood quietly at the edge of her unraveling become the center of what was slowly stitching her back together. When night fell, and Clara gently reminded her to rest, Evelyn stood, but before she left, she leaned down close to his ear. "Don't leave me," she whispered, voice trembling. "Not now. Not when I've finally found someone I don't have to be afraid to love." Then she pressed her lips gently to the back of his hand and left the room with a heart fuller than it had been in years. He couldn't kneel, but his eyes spoke the vow before his lips did. It had rained again in the night, the soft kind, the kind that didn't hammer rooftops or flood fields, but soaked the soil deep and quiet, as if trying to heal something beneath the surface. By morning, the town was hushed. Inside the room at Clara Whitcomb's boarding house, Wade Coulter lay propped against a pillow, half asleep, half listening to the distant clatter of dishes in the kitchen below. His side ached, his shoulder throbbed, but neither of those things mattered, because when he turned his head, Evelyn was there. She sat curled in the chair beside him, one hand resting in her lap, the other holding a worn book of poems she hadn't touched in hours. The candle beside her had long gone out, and the morning light spilled over her hair like copper fire. "You stayed," he said softly, voice rasping like gravel. Evelyn looked up, her face softened. "I did. How long?" "3 nights," she said, standing to pour him water. "But who's counting?" He took the cup with a trembling hand. "I would have stayed for you. I know," she whispered. "That's why I stayed." There was a pause. Not empty, just full of the kind of quiet that needs no explanation. "You saved that boy," she added. "Eli." Wade smiled faintly. "He's got more years left than I do." Just made sense. That doesn't make it less brave. "I wasn't trying to be brave." "You never are," she said. "That's what makes you different." He studied her face, then really studied it. The curve of her jaw, the small freckle just under her left eye, the softness that no longer hid behind caution. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach with fire on her head and fear in her bones, and he wasn't the same man who had once believed silence was his only protection. "I've been thinking about something," he said slowly. "Oh." He reached with his good hand toward the nightstand and drew out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He placed it on the blanket between them and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a ring. It wasn't polished or symmetrical. It bore tiny marks where the blade had slipped, but its silver surface gleamed soft in the morning sun. Around the outside was a carved pattern, rough but deliberate, a simple braid, just like the one she sometimes wore in her hair. "I made it a few weeks ago," he said. "Didn't know if I'd ever have the right moment." Her fingers hovered over it. "You made this from a silver buckle, took it off an old belt that didn't fit anymore." His smile was crooked, a little embarrassed. Figured something broken could still hold something beautiful. She blinked, and for a long moment didn't speak. He shifted, wincing. "I can't kneel," he said. "Doc says I shouldn't move too much for another week." "You don't need to," Evelyn said, voice barely above a breath. "I might not ever be good with words, might not always know the right thing to say, but I'll build you a home that won't shake when the wind blows, and I'll stand by you when folks get small-minded, and I'll never ask you to hide who you are." He looked at her with eyes steady and sure. "If you'll have me, Evelyn McAllister, will you be my wife?" She stared at the ring, then at the man who'd carved it with wounded hands and a heart that never asked to be noticed. She didn't cry. She smiled slowly, radiantly. A smile that began somewhere deep in her ribs and traveled up to her eyes. "I will," she said. "Not someday. Not maybe later. I want it soon," Wade added, his voice trembling now. "Before something else happens, before the world shifts again." She laughed through her tears then, nodding. "Soon is just fine." He exhaled, shoulders sinking against the pillow as though some invisible weight had lifted. She slid the ring onto her finger. It didn't fit perfectly, but it felt perfect. That evening, Evelyn stood at the mirror in her upstairs room, her hair, still damp from a wash, curled in soft waves over her shoulders. She picked up the wooden comb Clara had lent her and began brushing, slow and deliberate. For the first time since arriving in Redstone Ridge, She didn't reach for a scarf or a bonnet. She reached for flowers. Clara had clipped 3 tiny blooms from her windowsill. White, wild, imperfect. Evelyn wove them into her braid. Careful. Hands trembling just a little, she looked at her reflection, truly looked, and saw no curse, only fire and life, and the face of a woman no longer afraid to be seen. When she stepped outside, the wind lifted the ends of her shawl. The sky was painted in soft strokes of pink and gold, and the world, for just a moment, felt brand new. As she walked to Wade's window, children waved from the porch of the bakery. Old Mrs. Breyer nodded from her rocking chair. Someone even called her name. Not girl, not that one. Her name. She smiled, touched the flower in her hair, and walked toward the man waiting with both hands open, even the broken one. Not white, not ivory. She walked down the aisle with a crown of red, and he smiled like it was the only color he'd ever loved. The chapel at Redstone Ridge had never looked so full. Morning sunlight filtered through the narrow windows, warming the old cedar pews and catching dust in gentle halos. Fresh flowers, wild roses, white daisies, and lavender lined the windowsills. Clara Whitcomb had sewn every ribbon by hand, staying up well past midnight with her thimble and thread. Outside, horses shuffled quietly, tied along the rails. Boots were brushed, collars were straightened. Even Mr. Halpern from the general store had cleaned his vest. But it wasn't the decorations or the crowd that made people hold their breath as the music began. It was the bride. Evelyn McAllister stood at the chapel doors, sunlight at her back, hair unbound and glowing. A soft crimson gown, hand-dyed and stitched by her own fingers, clung gently to her frame. Simple, but proud. No veil covered her face, no modesty shaded her flame. Atop her head, woven into her braid, were 7 red blossoms, and when she stepped forward, the room did not gasp. It sighed. Wade stood at the front of the aisle, leaning slightly on a carved cane Daniel Thorne had whittled from red oak. His jacket was borrowed. His boots were scuffed, but his eyes, those quiet, steady eyes, watched her like she was a hymn he'd waited his whole life to hear. Clara, in a soft gray dress, stood behind Evelyn, her face brighter than anyone had ever seen it. And beside Wade, little Eli Thorne straightened his vest with all the seriousness a 10-year-old could muster. The preacher's voice trembled once before it steadied. "We gather not because the world is perfect," he said, "but because these 2 souls have chosen love in spite of it." When Evelyn reached Wade, she didn't wait for permission. She reached for his hand, the one still wrapped in linen, and held it tightly. "You sure about this?" he whispered. "Only thing I've ever been sure of," she whispered back. The vows were brief, but their eyes never left each other. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause, not out of habit, but out of something deeper. Relief, gratitude, hope. And as they turned to walk down the aisle together, a letter slipped from Clara's shawl, folded, plain, and unaddressed. She handed it to Evelyn once they stepped outside. "It came yesterday," Clara whispered, "from Kansas City. No return address." Evelyn unfolded it slowly. "To the red-haired woman in Redstone Ridge. I heard your name from the lips of a miner's daughter, then again from the grocer's cousin. Word travels, even across counties. I was once the first Mrs. Kane. I want you to know what he said about you, what he did to you. It wasn't just you. It wasn't your fault. It never was. I wore a veil too long. I hid bruises beneath sleeves, swallowed shame, in silence. I escaped, barely. And when I did, I stopped being brave. But hearing about you, walking into that town with fire on your head and steel in your spine, it gave me back something I thought I'd buried. Thank you. Live loudly. Love loudly. For both of us. R. Evelyn folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling just slightly. Wade looked over. Bad news. She shook her head, voice caught in her throat. No, just closure. The reception was simple bread, jam, and apple pie beneath a canopy of lanterns strung between trees. Children played tag in the grass. Old men sipped coffee from tin mugs and talked softly about the good kind of storms. Someone found a fiddle, someone else brought a harmonica. Evelyn and Wade didn't dance, but they stood beside each other, laughing, listening. Wade's arm rested around her waist like it had always belonged there. At dusk, Clara hugged them both tight. "You're not just married," she said. "You're anchored now." And they were. When the stars blinked into the sky and the candles burned low, Wade reached for Evelyn's hand once more. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Anywhere," she answered. They walked away from the chapel, past the apple tree where Evelyn once waited in the rain. Past the shop where she'd sewn dignity back into every stitch, past the old hitching post where a cowboy once stood and saw a girl not cursed, but courageous. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of promise, of breath, of 1,000 unspoken vows, and as they disappeared into the shadows of their new life, Evelyn's red gown shimmered like an ember that would never go out. Time silvered her hair, but the flame never dimmed. Not in his eyes. 20 years had passed on the land outside Redstone Ridge. The winters still stole heat from the earth, and summers still baked the fields golden. But something in the heart of the farm stayed warm like the embers of a fire that refused to die. When the morning sun rose, it caught on Evelyn's hair not crimson anymore, but silver strands woven with the same quiet strength it had always carried. She sat at the kitchen table, knitting tiny socks for the newborn from a ball of wool that once belonged to Clara. 3 children sat at her feet, chattering about chores and school, their laughter weaving through the room. Wade, the same steady hands that had carried her trunk, held her during storms, and whispered vows before midnight was in his workshop beside the house. Sparks flew like early fireflies as he shaped horseshoes and mended plows. His gray-streaked hair glowed in the sunlight, and when his eyes met hers through the doorway, they softened the way they always had, gentle, unwavering, anchored. They had built this life from dust and hope. The farm was modest, a whitewashed house with green shutters, a red barn in need of a fresh coat every few years, and a schoolhouse down the lane where Evelyn taught once a week. Her students were wild-hearted kids from nearby homesteads. She read to them from dusty primers, taught them to write letters, and encouraged them to ask questions she'd never asked herself as a girl. She'd whispered once to Wade that teaching felt like planting seeds in places that needed more light. He'd simply smiled. "You know how to grow people," he'd said. Today, they were all home for supper, cornbread, stew, and a batch of Mrs. Thorne's apple pie. Maggie, their eldest, now 12, held court at the table, talking about a science book she was reading. "Mom," she said suddenly, her green eyes deliberately catching Evelyn's. "Why don't you dye your hair silver like the other ladies? You'd look just like them." Evelyn paused over her spoon. The question struck deeper than the season's chill. She looked at her reflection in the window pane. Her hair was silver. Yes, but flames still flickered through the same bright crest that had once brought her scorn, then love, and finally, home. She met Maggie's curious gaze, because She began slowly. This hair helped your father see me the way I needed to be seen, not as someone cursed, but as someone brave enough to stay. Maggie looked from her mother to her father, whose calloused hand rested gently on Evelyn's shoulder. Wade's eyes glistened with something like awe or love or both. "You're my fire," he whispered. Evelyn blinked back tears. "And you are my safe place." They ate in silence after that, full of comforting food and the hum of contentment. Evening settled like a being with soft wings. The sunset painted the horizon in shades of rose and amber that rivaled Evelyn's young hair. The children cleared the table and ran outside to chase fireflies, their laughter mingling with crickets. Inside, the light dimmed to a soft glow. Wade stood, sliding a chair for Evelyn by the window. "Come, sit," he offered quietly. "Let's watch it settle." She rose slowly, offering her hand. He helped her, careful of the old ache in his ribs, and guided her to the chair. They watched the sky together. The farm was quiet now. The barn door closed, horses content in their stalls, the field still and knowing. The world outside might have changed, towns built, railroads laid, seasons turned, but in this moment, time paused. Wade cleared his throat, voice gentle. "There was a time I thought light like yours burned too fierce that it'd burn everything around it down." Evelyn set her hand on his. "I used to think I needed to hide it." He shook his head. "But you stood anyway, and you stayed anyway." He nodded. "With you." They didn't speak again. No words could hold what they'd built. As the last rays drifted behind the ridges, Evelyn rested her head on Wade's shoulder. The fireflies glowed in the twilight like embers come alive again. This was the life she'd never dared to believe in. No more threats from collapse or lies kept in shadows. No more abandonment. Just love, just home. Just the knowledge that some flames, no matter how they change, never go out. And in that hush of settling dust and softened light, they were exactly where they belonged. In a world that often asks us to dim who we are to fit in, to be less, to stay quiet. Evelyn's story reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stay. Stay true to who we are. Stay standing when judgment surrounds us. Stay open, even after rejection. Her red hair wasn't a curse, it was a crown. And the very thing that once brought her shame became the reason someone saw her fully for all she was and all she could be. It's a gentle reminder the parts of us that others might fear or misunderstand are often the very parts that hold our strength, whether it's a scar, a story, a belief, or a dream. Those are not burdens. They're the flames that keep us lit. No matter our age, it's never too late to choose love over fear and courage over retreat. And sometimes, healing begins the moment we decide we don't have to hide anymore. Thank you for spending time with us today and for listening with an open heart. If this story touched you, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribing to Wild West Echoes for more heartfelt tales from the frontier. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive and keeps the flame burning.